I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. If you live in Alberta or have spent any time there, you may have been on a road trip, a little vacation, where you've driven from Calgary out to Drumheller. I spent a couple of years living in Calgary as a kid, and I remember doing my little field trip with school out to the Royal Tyrrell Museum and seeing this landscape change from this grassy, very green and yellow prairie to this weird, almost kind of alien landscape as we drove further and further out of the city. This landscape, the Badlands, is the setting for Corinna Chong's new novel, aptly titled Badland. Badlands centers on a misfit named Regina. Regina unexpectedly reunites with her brother and her young niece, and as the story unfolds, she uncovers dark truths that expose her family and her life in a new light. This novel is a great reminder of what can happen when you take off some of the filters in life and see things for what they really are without illusions or false memories. And it's also a reminder that sometimes what you see when you take off those filters is not actually something that you want to see. I reached Corinna Chong at her home in Kelowna, British Columbia. So this book, it generated like so many just mixed emotions in me. It was an amazing read, but I was like kind of bewildered and didn't know how to feel at the end of it, which is a good feeling to have with a novel, I find. I want to start from the beginning, though, for our listeners. The story begins with Regina, your main character, envisioning her niece seeing the Badlands in Alberta for the first time as she's driving up from the United States with her father. And it's this almost otherworldly description. So can you describe for us what it's like driving into that part of southeastern Alberta? Because I know some of our listeners will have been there and others maybe have never seen this landscape.
There's something sort of uncanny and magical, I think, about going to the Badlands. At least that was my experience when I was a kid. Having grown up in Calgary, I did, frequent trips to the Badlands. And yeah, it's an interesting experience because, as many people know, Alberta is very flat. So, there's prairies, miles and miles of prairies, as far as the eye can see, big open blue skies. It's beautiful, but it's also sort of the same. You drive for, hours on straight roads. So when you go to the Badlands, there's a distinct point at which you turn off the highway, and then suddenly you're sinking down into a valley, and you're suddenly surrounded by these weird layered hills, and you can see the sort of heavy erosion working its way on down those hills. For me, when I was a kid, it felt like being transported into another world. I used to imagine that I was actually going back in time as I drove into the Badlands and going back into the time of the dinosaurs. And so I really wanted to capture that with the opening of this novel because the setting is such an important part of the tone, the atmosphere, the mood, even the conflict with the characters. And I wanted to establish that from the beginning.
Yeah. So, and I appreciate, this experience of growing up in Calgary and as a child going into this eerie landscape. That's my only experience with the Badlands. I've never visited as an adult and kind of had this opportunity to like reassess through adult eyes what I'm seeing. But the reason that I went as a kid was always really centered around it's like Dinosaur City, right? It's the home of Dinosaur Provincial Park. One character in this novel refers to this as being almost like Drumheller is like a fake town, and there's a bit of an artifice to the actual settlement that's in this Badlands ecosystem. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that means to you, that this is almost like there's a fakeness or an artifice to it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting aspect of Drumheller when you visit. There's a stark juxtaposition, I would say, between this tourism industry that drives the town of Drumheller and the actual landscape itself. So when you're standing in downtown, you can see all these kitschy landmarks. There's concrete dinosaurs everywhere on the street corners, right? There's one green triceratops with little bows on her horns, and she's just sitting at a bus stop. And so there's these little characters all over the town. And then, of course, there's the tourist shops that sell all the, trinkets and keychains and whatever else. But then, this is all set against the backdrop of the Badlands, which is a very real, visceral setting. And so I thought that juxtaposition was really interesting. It's also a really interesting theme for me to think about, fakeness more broadly for these characters, because of course they are lying to themselves in many ways by repressing a lot of their traumatic, painful memories.
Hmm. I want to talk a little bit about the book's title, because the book's title is two words, Bad Land, derived, I guess, from the Badlands ecosystem designation and the name of the region. Why did you make the choice to title your novel in this way?
So, one of the things that was interesting to me, even from the get go with this book, was to think about like why we call this kind of landscape Badlands
Hmm.
and where that comes from. How can a land be bad? What does that mean exactly? But then also to think about the implications of that word bad, because I think it's such a loaded word. And one of the major themes that I wanted to play with running across this story is the way in which we might use that word as a label for
Hmm.
people who transgress, for people who in whatever like way don't conform to social expectations, maybe even commit actions that we would consider to be violent, in other words, bad. And what happens when we label them with this, term, how we, in a sense, are relegating them to a different space.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up this idea of this tension between good and bad, and there's like a religious almost connotation, I feel like, sometimes to the terms of good and bad, and a desire to like have a way of categorizing the world and a way of almost like for individual people, like navigating perhaps like trauma that's happened to them of like, oh, these people who did this to me are bad people. I'm a good person, and therefore anything I do in response is justified. Like, what's informed the way that you think about morality? Because you seem to have a very nuanced take on it that not everyone is always able to access, I think.
I think you're probably right about the fact that it's got its roots in religion. And what is religion for but to try to make sense of chaos, right? We, maybe resort to reductive ways of categorizing people because that helps us to feel like we're in control in a world that is totally out of our control. But yeah, I think that what results is that we're oversimplifying most situations. And to me, that's a really interesting conundrum to probe. And for me, it's part of the reason I write is just I'm very interested in people and what it is that drives them to make decisions. We all make bad decisions, but at the heart of most of those decisions is something else, right? It's maybe it's trauma, maybe it's something interpersonal, right? Some kind of deep-seated complex that we're trying to deal with, that we're trying to express through those decisions. So I wanted it to be first and foremost about figuring out what it is that has brought them to this point. When they're
Hmm.
up against pressure, how do they respond? And how is that response informed by everything that has happened to them up to this point?
Hmm. Yeah, it almost felt in a way like reading a mystery novel a little bit, in the sense that we're introduced to these characters at the beginning and they're acting in ways that perhaps, as the reader, seem a bit confusing, right? Because we don't have initially the full context of everything that has happened to them as a family that has led to this sort of situation, as you say, like, how did we get here? I want to circle back to talking about Regina, or Regina would be the German pronunciation, I guess, the main character and narrator in this novel. And we get this sense from very early on in the novel that she thinks that there's something like inherently bad or almost evil or dark that's inside of her. What sort of a life is she living when we first meet her?
Yeah, she's living a very isolated life. And I think that that is by choice, but that it's also partly motivated by how she has been ostracized throughout her life. She has a hard time connecting with others. She is a very large person and therefore is very visible. And at the same time, in a sort of metaphorical social sense, she is invisible, right? She's rendered invisible because she's seen as having very little power in the society. And so, yeah, I think that all of that, in addition to the questionable upbringing she's had with her mother and her brother, as we find out in the book, her mother left sort of without a trace when Regina and Ricky were in their early adulthood. I think because of all of these things, she has found it easier to be alone and easier to be solitary. But I also think that she's internalized a lot of that trauma as being her fault.
Mm.
There's an epigraph that begins the book. It comes from Anne Carson, and there's a amazing line in Anne Carson's The Glass Essay. She says, "Girls are cruelest to themselves." And I think that's very true for both Regina and Jez, the little girl character. And might be true in some ways for, I think Carson is speaking broadly about all women and the way that women are socialized to direct some of that pain back onto themselves.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I want to talk about sort of the generations of women and the way that that dynamic of directing pain and guilt back onto yourself reproduces itself, I would say, really, with Regina's mother, with Regina and with Jez, the niece character. I want to ask, though, first about Regina's sort of status as a misfit. As you say, like, she doesn't really fit in physically. She's described as being very large, both like in terms of height and in terms of weight as well. And she's socially awkward and a bit of a loner. There's these scenes of like her coworker trying to set her up on these dates that are total just disasters and uncomfortable for everybody involved. What inspired you to put this kind of misfit character, and particularly a misfit woman, at the center of your story?
I really love misfit characters, just generally. Those are the characters I gravitate towards. And I think we can empathize with that sort of experience. All of us can, of feeling like an outsider. I was really inspired by a lot of other books, including Jeanette Winterson's Sexing the Cherry. I've written a little bit about this on Instagram, but when I read Jeanette Winterson's work, I think she does this so well. She takes these larger than life, unbelievable female characters, and they're incredibly strong characters, but they're also, essentially what Winterson is trying to do is subvert all expectations, right? So they're a complete subversion of everything that we would expect a woman to be. And I loved that. And I really wanted to do that also with this book.
Yeah, I love hearing you talk about Jeanette Winterson in your writing and just now, because I haven't read Sexing the Cherry, but I did read some of her other work when I was in university and found it super impactful for the reasons that you describe. And I have been meaning to go back to her work. So when I heard you talking about it, I was like, this is another cue that I need to go to the library and get back on my Jeanette Winterson beat for sure. So talking about generations of women that dominate the novel, because Regina is not the only unusual or this sort of ostracized other woman who's a little bit weird and out of step with society's expectations. Her mom and her niece are definitely also a little bit that way in their own ways. Was there something that you wanted to explore maybe about perceptions of femininity and what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a woman who doesn't meet certain expectations of womanhood? Was there something you were trying to explore through these characters?
Absolutely. I think that the fact that there are these three generations of women and that there's a clear link between them is definitely something I want to explore. I guess it comes to that sort of nature nurture question that's really interesting to me. How much of who we are is passed down, and how much of who we are is built into us, right? And I think that's an impossible question to answer, but one that these characters, I think, are grappling with all the time. So I think for Regina, there's a real fear for her that she's like her mother. And so I think unknowingly she's kind of working against that at the same time as she's kind of obsessed with her mother. Like, she's always talking about her mother, and her mother is really all that she knows, all that she's ever known. And everything she knows about herself is informed by her experiences with her mother.
Yeah, we've been talking so much about Regina's mom, and I want to delve into a bit more of the specifics of Regina's mom's personality. So Regina's enamored with Mutti, she calls her, which is German for mummy, and she often sort of cites German phrases that her mom would have said around the house growing up and references the village that her mom comes from, even though Regina herself didn't really live there for any significant period of time. Her relationship with it really is through her mom's stories. What were you drawing from creating Muti's persona and this backstory for this family?
Yeah, I was drawing a lot on my own experiences of my Oma. My mom's family is German. My mom grew up in Germany, and my Oma grew up in Germany during the Second World War. And she didn't speak that much English. We didn't have too close of a relationship with her growing up. And in sort of maturing and growing beyond childhood, I realized I had all these questions about her and her life. And the glimmers that I got of what her life would have been like as a child growing up in Germany in the Second World War, and then, to kind of move into becoming a mother and then her own daughter marrying a Chinese man and having these two children, my sister and I, who are half Chinese. I feel like things changed so rapidly for her within that time. And, there's a really vivid story in my family. I don't even want to call it a memory because I don't even remember it exactly, but it's kind of one of these tales that is told in my family of when we were kids. We visited my Oma's dad, so my great grandpa. And when we got there, he said to my mother in German, how dare you bring those Black children here?
Mm.
And my mom turned around immediately. We got back in the car, we drove away, and my sister and I didn't even really know what was happening. But that story sort of lived on in my family as, part of the reason that my mom never spoke to her grandpa again, but also as this sort of reminder of, how much things had changed from generation to
Hmm.
generation for us. But also it kind of planted this thing in my mind where, I was always thinking about how I was different in that sense. And that, there were people in my family who did not think that was okay. There was extreme racism in my own family.
Hmm.
So that's a really interesting, dilemma for one's self identity, I think.
Yeah.
And one that I think filters its way into this book. So, I'm thinking a lot as I developed Muti about how she mirrors my Oma. And in writing her, I was trying to figure out my Oma a little bit and try
Hmm.
to unpack some of that mystery, or even like imaginatively put myself into her space because it felt so distant from me in so many ways as a kid. I think I was channeling some of that into what happens with Regina and Jez also, because there's a certain point at which Regina learns information about Jez that makes her feel as though she needs to be her protector.
Hmm.
Right. And she has a very similar reaction to my mom in that in that story where, she kind of scoops up Jez and says, okay, well, I'm going to protect you because, you're in a situation where other people are not willing to protect you. Right.
Hmm. I'm so glad you brought that up as an example of this dynamic in the book because I wanted to talk more about Jez, who's such a fascinating character. It's interesting. She's the one child that we really see and follow in this book, and we often think of a child character who's being, as you say, scooped up and protected as a character that's perhaps innocent, is like the one non-villain in the story. But Jez is also super complicated and has this like dark side that perhaps is familial, this darkness and this badness that's inside her. What inspired you to write this kind of character?
I love writing children, probably because I love children, but also I think they can be really interesting devices in narratives because they're so honest and they're so themselves. And again, in this book that deals a lot with the difference between fake and real and just sort of sussing out like what is authenticity and what is realness. I think Jez is that. She doesn't put on airs at all, even though the way that she behaves is not really acceptable by most people's standards. Part of why I wanted to work with a child in this story as well is that, I wanted to think about putting my characters in a situation to be judged, but then children can be really illuminating for the way that we apply those, codes of morality. And so I wanted her to be that character who is a kind of mirror of Regina. Both of them are really complex characters, and trying to understand their behavior then outside of these very reductive, black and white, good versus bad, I think that was, what I was trying to achieve in the story. So I think a child character can be a really interesting way to do that.
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to something we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, talking about the landscape and Alberta's Badlands. And there's this allegory sort of that runs through the book about bones and fossils, right? Because the Badlands are one of the world's largest repositories of dinosaur bones. That's what a lot of people know them for. And we've been talking about these like layers being uncovered of these characters' stories, and they're being put under pressure. And even the language you're using to describe the story is like the same language that we use to talk about fossil formation, right? That it's formed through pressure, and then layers get uncovered and things get exposed and the land gets eroded away. What is it about fossils that left such an impression on your imagination that you incorporated them into the book in this way?
Yeah, I find fossils really fascinating. I think that it's interesting that we can uncover these things from the ground and then use them to understand what life was like thousands and thousands of years before humans were even here. Like, that is so fascinating to me. But I'm also really interested in what a fossil is, because I think, commonly when we talk about dinosaur bones, we talk about them as bones, right? It's, well, like, this place has a lot of dinosaur bones, but, of course, they're not actually bones, they're fossils. And so the process of fossilization became really interesting to me to use as a metaphor for what's happening with these characters too. Like, a fossil is minerals, right? So in the process of being compacted, buried down in the earth with immense pressure being put down on them, the bone material has actually eroded away and been replaced by minerals. But the fossil is an exact copy of the bone. And so we have a tendency to call them then bones because they look exactly like they once did. That to me is a really interesting parallel to the way that we think about memories and the past, right? Because memories too, we think of as copies of experiences, but they're not, right? Mm-hmm. They're filtered through our own imagination. They're given significance based on, how we want to understand them in relation to ourselves. And they can actually change over time as well. Mm-hmm. Just like a bone transforms into a fossil, a memory too transforms into something else, a new object that is like a semblance or a copy of the original.
Mm-hmm. The mutability of memory is something that fascinates me so much, and it's kind of scary thinking about how our perceptions of the world can be flawed and imperfect. How do you think that fiction can reflect these complexities and these like truths that maybe aren't really true? Because I felt like this book was a really interesting kind of exploration of that theme.
I mean, I'm a firm believer that fiction needs to be truthful in order to be powerful. Like, what does it mean to write the truth in fiction? Because, of course, fiction is inherently not factual, right? But I think there's a difference between truth and fact, right? And I think the most powerful pieces of literature are those that kind of force us to confront truths about ourselves, about our world that we didn't even know until we read that piece of literature. And I think that's like ultimately what I'm trying to aim for, is like, how can I connect to readers and illuminate something that is essentially truthful to the human experience through fiction. And I think the beautiful thing that fiction can do, and other forms of literature also, is they can defamiliarize the familiar in a way that allows us to see something anew, right? Because it's so easy to just walk through life without noticing. But I think fiction can force us to notice by putting us into the world of someone else and look at the world through fresh eyes and thereby start to see it in a new way.
Corinna, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. You too.
Corinna Chong is the author of Badland. And Corinna won the CBC Short Story Prize, and you could be the next winner. Submissions for the 2025 CBC Short Story Prize are open now. Your work could be published on the CBC Books website, and you could win $6,000 from the Canada Council for the Arts and a writing residency at the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. Go to cbcbooks.ca for all the details. That's it for the show this week. This episode was produced by Lisa Matthews. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Special shout out also to everyone on the team for putting the show together this week and every week, including our amazing radio techs and the wider CBC Books team. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.